So I started this podcast to get across a philosophy that I think is really important, and that is the idea that life can be a lot easier and more effortless than what we think. That life is so much more enjoyable and fulfilling when we make it easier on ourselves. Whatever challenge we face, there's always a low stress or a high stress way to get through it. But by default, we often take the high stress way. Perhaps it's because we don't think we have another option, we don't know what else to do instead, or it's just out of habit. It's the way that we've always done things, so it always has to be that way. Well, the aim of this podcast is to flip that on its head, to help you become more sensitive to the easier routes in life, the low stress ways to accomplish your goals, overcome challenges, and get more of the things that you want. And I think one of the biggest things that can make life a lot harder than what it needs to be is not being able to forgive. Holding on to resentment, hurts, anger, the bruising of our ego, you name it, the whole shebang, continually revisiting old memories of times where we've been wronged or disrespected, and just not being able to move on in general. So in this episode of the podcast, we're going to take a look at the art of forgiveness, how to let go of all of that trapped, ill feeling that we can keep inside of us whenever we believe that we've been wronged or betrayed in some way. Hey there and welcome to the Stress Less Living podcast. My name is Stephen Burns and I've been a practicing coach, trainer and hypnotherapist for 25 years. Each week I'll share easily digestible bite-sized ideas that you can immediately put into practice so that you can live a more harmonious and balanced life. On this podcast you can expect mindset advice, strategies for dealing with big modern day problems like stress, overwhelm, burnout, perfectionism and procrastination, and also insights into tools like meditation and mindfulness. So if you're looking for the perfect antidote for the chaos of modern life, my friend, you are absolutely in the right place. So in this episode, I'm going to share a lot more personal information than what I would normally be comfortable sharing. And I'm not just doing this to be deliberately emotive or anything like that, or to get back at anyone. It's wholly relevant to what we're going to be talking about, the art of forgiveness. So when I was in my 20s to early 30s, I was in a long-term relationship. So we lived together for 2 years. But the relationship never really felt right to me. In truth, I should have ended it a lot sooner, but I just stuck with the familiar and ended up going on for nearly 10 years. So then, not long after my 30th birthday, something snapped inside of me and I decided to end it. And let's just say it didn't really go that well. Now, I'm not saying that I was entirely blameless. In retrospect, I definitely was not. But some of her behaviour post-split was really unacceptable and tough to take. So just to give you a condensed version, so we lived together for several months after the split because we had to come up with some kind of financial arrangement. So then one day, once we had agreed the financial side of things, I came home from work and the house had been completely emptied. There was some damage that had been done and all of the bank accounts had been drained and put into overdraft. Also on top of that, in the weeks prior, I discovered that she had basically taken all of the money out of the joint savings account, which was roughly around about 10k. So we're talking British pounds here. And this was all before I had to buy her out of the house because, of course, we had a joint mortgage. So I was put in a very bad financial position. And just to compound things, when we got the house valued, it was right before the financial crisis in 2008. So the house was valued at its peak. So I naively, at the time, signed a contract saying that I was going to give her a certain amount of money to buy her out of the house. So it was in the region of about 75k. But then the financial crisis hit. And guess what happened? The house price plummeted, but I was still contracted to give her that amount of money. So I asked her to renegotiate, and also I was looking to be reimbursed for the money that was taken out of the joint accounts, but she didn't want to. So I had to then take her to court to try to renegotiate the contract, and this whole thing went on for about 8 months, and the only people who benefited were the lawyers. So the offshoot of this was I had to remortgage my house, and of course when you do that, the bank know you're desperate, they've got you by the balls, and you end up on a higher rate of interest, and this whole thing just escalated for me financially. Now if you're listening to this and you're getting heart palpitations right now, now, then you'll be getting pretty close to how I was feeling back then. It was quite desperate times. So eventually things did get back on track. It took me well over a year to recover financially from it. But even after that stage, there was still so much anger and resentment that stayed with me, and it was affecting me on a regular basis. I thought about it a lot. It was affecting relationships. I just didn't feel like I could trust anyone. So eventually it came to a head, and I thought, you know what, enough is enough. I need to do something about this. So I took myself through a process from NLP, that's neuro-linguistic programming, that's designed to create forgiveness. And it went a long way to releasing all of that anger, hurt, resentment, all of that stuff, so I could finally move on. So I want to talk a wee bit about that process in this episode, but I just want to say I will be glossing over it. What I'm about to talk about is really going to help you forgive. But if you're interested in learning more, then please do drop me an email at info@mindschool.net, and I can send you details of a full training I have on it. This is definitely a subject that's very personal to me. So let's dig into it, shall we? So what do we actually mean when we talk about the art of forgiveness? Well, forgiveness can mean lots of different things to different people, but essentially it's where we make an intentional decision to let go of resentment and anger. So the classic is that we believe that someone has wronged us in some way, they've betrayed us or they've hurt us, and we've been holding on to all of that anger, the hurt, the disappointments, the resentments, the bruising of the ego, all of that stuff for far too long. And we reach a point where we just decide enough is enough. It's time to let all of this go. Also, there tends to be a secondary layer to forgiveness as well, or lack of forgiveness. Because we don't want to be hurt like that again in the future, we end up creating coping mechanisms. And these coping mechanisms help us stay safe in the moment to get us through that phase of life, but they almost always create another layer to the problem. So as an example, say you get hurt in a relationship, someone cheats on you and you're utterly devastated. In order to protect yourself from that hurt in the future, you might create a coping mechanism that prevents you from trusting people. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you don't give someone your trust, then they can't betray your trust because they don't have it in the first place. And the thing is, that coping mechanism helps you get through that traumatic time, but it ends up becoming a problem for you in the future because you can't function properly in a relationship if you don't have trust. So forgiveness for me is not just about letting go of the original betrayal. It's about also redefining or letting go of the coping mechanism. And this is often a bit that people forget. You need to address both of these to get complete resolution. Also, the second point I want to make is that forgiveness is, or at least it should be, a natural process. Often, if we just give something a bit of time, we start to experience it through a different lens. We eventually look back through older and wiser eyes, and we see the situation in a different way, and this naturally leads to forgiveness. And this is, of course, often why people say that time is the greatest healer. But sometimes that doesn't happen. We don't get the gift of perspective that time often gives, and that ill feeling just seems to stay there. Or it just takes too damn long. You have to live with all of that resentment, anger, and toxicity for months, potentially years, which is not healthy. So it's under these circumstances where we have to intervene. We need to take a look at it and do something about it. So let's look at how to actually do that. Let's put some meat on the bones. How do you actually forgive? Well, there's two parts that I want to cover in this podcast, this episode. And like I said, I'm just going to be glossing over this. If you want a bit more information on this, then please do drop us an email at info@mindschool.net. I'll point you in the right direction. So like I said, there's two parts to it, or two steps. Step number one is where you remove the blocks or the objections to forgiving. And step number two is where you use an amazing model that's been taken from NLP, and that's called perceptual positions. So let's talk about each of these one by one, shall we? So step number one is where you're looking to remove the blocks or objections that you have to forgiving. So like I said a moment ago, forgiveness should be a natural process. But sometimes it's not. The ill feeling sticks with us. And one of the reasons that happens is because we have an inner objection to letting it go. So there's a thing I read a while back about how animals in nature deal with bad experiences. So what they do is, it's pretty cool. They go off into the wild and they physically shake off the bad experience. And that is it. They then go about their business. And if they didn't do this, they would perish. They wouldn't survive. But the thing is, as human beings, we have the tendency to hold on to things, don't we? We can't physically shake things off in this simple manner. Sometimes we can hold on to things for months, years, potentially even decades. And one of the reasons why we do this is because deep down we believe that the problem is serving us in some way. And this becomes a block, it becomes an objection to the change that prevents us from moving on. So the first step to forgiveness is to examine and release these objections. And what this does is it gives you the go-ahead to forgive. The analogy I like to use is it's a little bit like being at traffic lights. If you were at a red light, it would just feel like you can't go, you're not allowed. But when it turns green, it's like, let's go, every part of you gets the go-ahead to move forward. That's what it's like when you remove the blocks. You get the green light to forgive. So let me ask, what's stopping you from forgiving? Assuming that you have someone in mind, what objection are you holding on to that's preventing you from just letting this go? There's almost always something in there, and when we address that, something big shifts inside of us. And you start to think, you know what? I think now is the right time. I've been holding on to this for far too long. So what really is it that's stopping you from forgiving? So if you want to explore this a bit more, a route that you can also go down is to consider what forgiveness means to you. Sometimes the meaning that we've attached to it is preventing us from letting go. That is the block, that's the objection. To give you another personal example, so most of you listening to this will know that I create a lot of online training courses. So I started doing this about 6 years ago, and for the first few courses that I made, I did them with one of my students from my face-to-face certification programs. And much to my surprise, when we released them, they became very successful very quickly on a platform called Udemy, or Udemy, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. So everything was going great, and then all of a sudden I got an email from my governing body, and they told me that they had checked out my online courses and they did not approve of what I was doing. They felt that it was devaluing the face-to-face programs that I do, the certification programs. And if I don't remove myself from them immediately, they would then throw me out of the governing body and I wouldn't be able to certify anybody in NLP. So I was basically in between a rock and a hard place. So I phoned up the person who had been doing the online courses with, and I asked him to temporarily take them out of the marketplace just to give me a chance to speak to my governing body. And he didn't want to do it, which was understandable. You know, we were making quite a lot of money from them, and if I was in his position, I might not have been too keen to take them down either. But I had to do something, or I was going to be thrown out of my governing body. So I eventually had to use more formal methods to persuade him to change his mind. So basically, I did a thing called a digital takedown to get the courses taken off the marketplace. But without going into the gory details, he took the courses down and he agreed to create his own version so that I was completely separate from them and I retained my ability to give NLP certification. So all was good, right? Well, not really. About a month later, he published his versions of the courses and I decided just to check them out to see what they were all about. And lo and behold, I discovered that he'd basically just taken the work that I had done and regurgitated it in big sections of the trainings. And I'm not just talking about information that's in the public domain that he had put his own spin on. I'm talking specific models here that I had created and named. There were several models and techniques that he had included that you won't find in any books or in any manual outside of my own face-to-face training courses. So he had basically filmed himself teaching these models and he hadn't even changed the names of some of them. There was even one bit where he had lifted a piece out of our certification training manual and just changed the branding to his. I guess imitation is the most sincerest form of flattery, as they say. Now, I'm not going to get into the ins and outs of whether or not this constitutes plagiarism, but at the time, it definitely made me angry. It made me very angry. At the end of the day, he was making a lot of money out of these courses, and in my opinion, it appeared as if he was doing it in a dishonest way that lacked integrity. Now, the point of this story is it took me ages to let go of that anger. Every time he popped up on Facebook, I would get angry. Every time I saw him on the platform, I would get even angrier. And then one day, all of a sudden, something dawned on me. I realised that the thing that was stopping me from letting this go was because I believed that to forgive this person meant that I was weak, that I wasn't standing up for myself. And that was where the anger was coming from. I believe that you should stand up for yourself, and in some way I was in violation of this sacred principle of mine. And in that moment, I suddenly realised that actually to forgive doesn't mean that I'm weak. It actually means the opposite. It means that I'm strong. That if you have the ability to forgive what appears to be an obvious betrayal, then that's a sign of real inner strength. And as soon as I got this insight, I got this huge, massive release. And that's the thing. So often the thing that's blocking us is the meaning that we've attached to forgiveness. So to turn the lens back on you, what does forgiving this person mean to you? Have a think about it. Does forgiveness mean that you're not standing up for yourself? Does it mean that you're going against your principles? Does it mean that you have to admit that you're wrong? Or does it mean that you're weak? And then once you've figured that out, you can then start to question that meaning. Does it really have to mean that? Are you sure it means that? Maybe it means something else. Does forgiveness really mean that you're weak? I don't think so. I think it means you're strong because you're taking the high ground here. But ultimately, what you want to look for is you want to figure out what is it that's preventing you from naturally letting this go. If you've been holding on to this for a long time, I guarantee that there'll be something in there. So what is it for you? It's time to address that. So, you're a busy person, you have a demanding job or a hectic lifestyle, and you've heard that meditation is a great way to reduce stress and create calm within the chaos that is your life. But you've tried meditation a few times, maybe with an app or from a book or a YouTube video, and it's just not really worked for you, and you've maybe jumped to the conclusion that meditation isn't for you. Well, if that's the case, I just want to say that it's most likely not your fault. A lot of the time when meditation doesn't really work that well, it's because you're missing a couple of key steps. And if you want to learn what those key steps are and some of the fundamentals of meditation, then I have a free video training that you can enrol on. If you want to check that out, I've included a link to it in the show notes and all the information that you need. So that is step 1, and step 2 is where you use this amazing NLP model called perceptual positions. So like I said, I'm not going to be going into this in huge detail. It just wouldn't do it justice, but I do want to give you an overview, and if you want more information about this whole forgiveness process, then just drop us a quick email. So, perceptual positions, what are they? Well, the idea is that whenever we are engaging in any kind of social interaction, there's generally 3 positions inside our minds that we can take when we're assessing and interpreting that experience. So the first is what we refer to as self. So this is where we are seeing the whole thing inside our imagination through our own eyes. We're connected with our own opinions, our beliefs, our thoughts, our feelings. Often if we get into an argument and we replay the argument over and over inside our mind, which is something that most people do, then the reason why we continue to feel angry about it is because we are replaying it through our own perspective. We're connected with our own thoughts, our own feelings, and of course, our own anger and resentment. So that's self. The second position is what we call the other. So this is where you take the psychological leap inside your imagination and you step into the other person's perspective and you start to see through their eyes, hear through their ears, and you feel connected with their intentions, their feelings, their past history, and you really get a sense of what it's like to be them temporarily. So this is what's often referred to as the empathy position, and it can be amazing when it comes to appreciating where a person is coming from because you're genuinely connecting with their feelings and intentions. It's like that famous Billy Connolly joke, never trust a man until you've walked a mile in his shoes, and then if you still don't like him, that's cool because you're a mile away and you have his shoes. But this is the empathy position, and it's something that I know you'll have experienced naturally. If you see someone who, for example, hurts themselves, maybe they cut themselves or they fall over and hurt their leg, something like that, then a lot of the time when we look at someone doing this, we get a jolt of pain. We go, that looks painful. And it didn't happen to us, it happened to them. But it's because we make that quick psychological leap in our imagination. We take their position and we imagine what it would be like to feel their pain. So this is something that we naturally do as human beings, some people more than others, but this is a crucial position, as we'll talk about very soon, when it comes to forgiveness. So then the third position is what we call the neutral observer's perspective. So this is where inside your mind you position yourself in your imagination directly in between you and the other person. And this allows you to look on from a place of pure objectivity, of pure neutrality. The analogy I like to use is it's a little bit like if you've ever gone through any mediation. So mediation is often required when you have two parties who are in conflict. Often it happens in the workplace. And what they do is they bring in someone who's completely neutral. They sit in between the two different parties. They don't take anyone's side and they just give that objective viewpoint and they look to create commonality between both of the partners. So it's kind of like that's what you're doing. You're looking on from that neutral place. You've removed emotion and you're just being objective. So like I said, I'm not going to be going into the details of this, but I do want to talk about the importance of taking the other position. That's the second one I described there. And the observer, the third one, when it comes to forgiveness. Both of these are absolutely crucial. In order to forgive, we first need to step into the other person's shoes and honestly see the world and the situation from their perspective. Often the reason why we can't forgive is because we're not truly stepping into the other person's shoes. We're stuck seeing it from our own perspective. Now, just to be clear, it doesn't mean that you're agreeing with them. You're just gaining a sense of what it's like for them and why they felt that this was the only course of action for them. And most of the time when you do this, you realise that it actually isn't about you, it's all about them. With my ex-girlfriend, when I stepped into her shoes, I could understand why she felt that this was the only option for her. If I'd have had her upbringing and I'd ended up in her situation, then I would have probably done the same, if I'm being totally honest. And again, to reiterate, I didn't agree with what she did morally, but I did understand why she did it. And understanding is the thing that leads to forgiveness. So stepping into the other person's position genuinely and honestly is a crucial part of the forgiveness process. If we don't do it, we just end up forever locked in our own feelings. But also another thing that you can add in is being able to then step into this neutral observer's position. So that third place that I talked about earlier, because it allows you to get objectivity. It allows you to look on and disconnect from the emotional intensity. Because when we're emotional about something, we don't think clearly, do we? Especially if it's a negative emotion. Research has shown extensively that when we're in an intense emotional state, our thinking is massively distorted. We just can't think straight. So the observer position helps us think clearly, and this can help us see things that we would normally have missed if we were only seeing it from our own perspective. So to look on from that disconnected space is super useful. So it gives us space and we can get some profound learnings from this position that can help us release the hurt and the anger. And ultimately what you're looking for from this position is some kind of useful learning that you can use in the future to become a better person. And I think this can be the thing that provides the final release for people that helps them completely let go of all of that ill feeling and finally move on. If we can glean some kind of important learning from the experience that can serve us in the future, it can transform a bad experience into a potentially good one. And I think this is true for all of our so-called bad experiences, by the way. We can potentially learn more from them than we do from the good ones. If something doesn't quite go the way that we'd like, how do we really know that that's an inherent bad experience? The truth is we don't. We make that initial assessment because it feels bad when it happens, but over the course of time, all the learnings that we can get from these could transform it into a great experience. When I think back to the event with my ex-girlfriend, at the time I thought this was the worst thing to have ever happened to me, and it certainly felt that way. But it was also a major turning point. From there, I started to live a very different type of life. I tried new things. I broadened my social circle way beyond what I thought I ever would. I focused more on setting up my business, and all manner of amazing things came because of that sudden change of life direction. And none of those things would have happened if I hadn't have had that experience. So for me, when I now look back, I don't see it as trauma. I see it as one of the most profoundly positive experiences of my life. Genuinely, and I'm not just saying that for effect, it absolutely is true. So every bad experience does have the potential to turn over time into a great one. But to turn it into that, we have to first see the profound learning that we can get from it. And to do that, you've got to look on from that observer's perspective. You won't get that when you're in the throes of emotion, seeing it through self. So if we were to do a quick experiment for just now, if you're struggling to forgive, stop for a moment and see it from the other person's perspective. Genuinely do it. It takes some time to explore this in your imagination. And also, if you were to look on from a place of complete neutrality, somewhere in the middle, looking on between you and the other person, what new learning could you glean that would benefit you in the future? You do that, the release you can get is incredible. So there you have it, the art of forgiveness in 2 steps. Step number 1 is where you examine and remove the blocks or objections to forgiving. And step number 2, you want to use that amazing model from NLP called perceptual positions. Now, there is a lot more to this. There is, for example, a 3rd step, which is where you use a forgiveness ritual, which can be a lovely way to seal the deal and finally release all of that resentment. And there are also a lot more details when it comes to using perceptual positions. So if this is a topic that you are interested in, that you're struggling with a little bit, and you want to know a little bit more information, then drop me an email, like I said earlier on, at info@mindschool.net, and I'll point you in the right direction. So thank you once again for listening to this week's episode of the podcast. If you enjoyed this, I would love it if you could follow or subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. And if you could leave a review, that would be fantastic. If you don't, hey, I forgive you. So thanks for listening, and I'll speak to you in the next episode.